What would you do if you saw a black man dressed in a plain canvas jacket quietly sit down in a first-class seat, only to be asked by a flight attendant to leave, simply because he didn't look like someone with a ticket? No one shouted. No one objected. The entire first-class cabin just went silent. A few glanced over. A few frowned. A few whispered, "He must be in the wrong seat." But the man didn't get up. He pulled out his ticket, seat 2B, accurate, not a row off. And then he sat still. In the coldness the entire system was sending his way. Not through words, but through stares. What they didn't know was, he didn't just have a ticket. He was the founder of that airline, the CEO behind the very plane they were flying on, the man who wrote the policies, designed the service, and even chose the seat 2B they just tried to take away from him. But he didn't say any of that. He didn't need to prove who he was. He simply stayed silent and remained. And it was that act of not leaving that forced the entire system to change, without a single apology, but through a quiet, decisive reckoning. No one would ever again be allowed to judge a person just by how they look. Not anymore. The morning didn't begin the way a high-profile CEO usually makes an entrance. No chauffeured car, no assistant holding a latte or a stack of briefing documents. Just a man walking through the glass doors of George Bush Intercontinental Airport in Houston at exactly 6:02 a.m. Charcoal gray windbreaker, dark slacks, one hand pulling a small cabin suitcase, the other holding a boarding pass. White shirt with two buttons undone, just enough to reveal the subtle outline of a platinum chain around his neck. No flashy watch, no gold cufflinks, no signifiers of power, except the eyes, calm, direct, and with nothing to prove. Malik Stokes had arrived. No one recognized him. To most of the travelers rushing to find their gates, he could have been a lawyer, a government contractor, or some mid-level executive, just successful enough to fly business class, but not remarkable enough to attract attention. And Malik preferred it that way. In a world loud with titles, sometimes the most powerful thing is silence. Chosen silence. Gate D23, Flight ST-114 to Washington, D.C., departs at 6:47. Not every flight carries symbolic meaning, but this route does. It's the unofficial corridor for lobbyists, policy advisors, top-tier lawyers, and those who turn influence into currency. On this flight, first class isn't a reward, it's a given. A way of saying, I belong here. Malik glanced at his ticket. Seat 2B. He smiled, just a little, for himself. Right behind him, a white woman in her early 50s approached with the posture of someone accustomed to priority treatment, platinum blonde hair styled in soft, deliberate waves. A cream-colored cashmere shawl rested elegantly over her shoulders, draping a wrinkle-free crimson dress that clung to her figure. A forest green handbag, genuine crocodile leather, hung from her arm like a silent declaration. She didn't look at Malik. She didn't need to. Harriet Caldwell had arrived. At the gate, the boarding agent nodded professionally. "Good morning, ma'am." Harriet held up her phone without looking up. "Harriet Caldwell, first class." The agent scanned her pass and smiled politely. "Welcome aboard." Harriet didn't respond. She turned and walked onto the jet bridge with the confidence of someone who's never been denied access. Malik stood two passengers behind. When he handed over his ticket, the agent paused slightly, eyes narrowing as if recognizing something, but Malik simply gave a faint nod and kept walking. He didn't need anyone to remember his name. Inside the business class cabin of the Boeing 787, the atmosphere radiated that specific hush found only in spaces where money and power converge. Deep gray leather seats with light gold trim, ambient lighting soft like a five-star hotel lounge. A gentle scent, cedarwood with a hint of citrus, lingered in the air, calibrated down to the milliliter to ensure no one felt like an outsider. Harriet had already settled into seat 2A. She arranged her belongings with deliberate precision, shawl draped over the seat back, feather-down neck pillow propped by the window, her Birkin bag angled to create a barrier between her and seat 2B. Finally, she retrieved a small silver-gray spray bottle from her purse, a brand not found in common stores. She sprayed twice toward the empty seat beside her, then exhaled sharply, as if warding off an invisible allergy. My skin is extremely sensitive to strong odors, she announced loudly, though no one had asked. Doctor's orders. Reactions can be quite severe. A flight attendant a few rows down nodded and made a note. Of course, ma'am. If you need any assistance, just let us know. Harriet smiled faintly, as if her preferences had just been confirmed, and tucked the spray bottle back into her bag, leaving part of it visible like a silent warning. This airspace is claimed. 6 rows away, Malik entered the cabin, eyes scanning seat numbers slowly. A few passengers looked up, then looked again. Not because they recognized him, but because there was something in his walk, in his gaze, in his quiet that pulled attention. The man in seat 4C squinted slightly, then returned to his iPad. Malik reached row 2. Harriet hadn't looked up. He paused gently. Good morning, his voice steady, low, and unapologetic. I believe this is my seat. Harriet glanced up behind oversized sunglasses. She smiled, but not warmly. Oh, I thought this row was still empty. So many upgrades these days, who can tell? Her tone was sweet but edged like crystal. She didn't move. The Birkin still blocked the shared armrest. Malik glanced up at the seat number. 2B, he said calmly. Harriet tilted her head slightly, picking up the spray bottle and hovering a finger over the nozzle. I should let you know, she began. I'm very reactive to strong scents. Chronic dermatological condition. Extremely sensitive skin. She glanced down at his open collar. If you're wearing cologne? I'm not, Malik replied. Oh, Harriet said, lowering her voice by half a pitch. But fabrics still hold odors. I'm sure you understand. Malik said nothing. He placed his case beneath the seat in front and sat down. The handbag remained firmly between them. The spray bottle stayed in place, a boundary marked by artificial fragrance. A passenger behind them cleared their throat, not from illness, but from discomfort. Another silently adjusted their seat, eyes now focused on row 2. In the cockpit, a cabin technician noted a subtle light blinking on the system panel. No technical fault, just a signal. A line of code logged into the system. Genesis initiated. The air remained quiet, but everything had just begun to change. Harriet adjusted her shawl like a queen preparing to ascend the throne. The spray bottle remained upright, a silent bodyguard perched on the shared armrest between the 2 seats. Malik sat motionless beside her, his leg angled slightly inward to make room for the Birkin bag, which clearly had no intention of yielding space. He didn't sigh. He didn't glance over. He didn't speak. His gaze stayed forward, one hand resting gently on his thigh, the other holding the corner of the boarding pass still lying in his lap like a quiet reminder. He was sitting in the right seat. The air wasn't heavy with scent, but with expectation. From row 3 back, an undercurrent of awareness crept in. Not yet a wave, but the early ripple of something out of place. Passengers instinctively straightened their backs, pretending to look at their phones while their eyes darted left and right. The man in 3D lowered his newspaper slightly. The woman in 5C tilted her iPad just enough to see through the side without drawing attention. No one said a word, but everyone was starting to realize something was happening in row 2. A young flight attendant, her name tag just barely visible beneath her vest, read Elena, passed by row 2 and slowed down. She smiled reflexively at both passengers, the kind of smile drilled into her by the second week of training. But her eyes passed lightly over Harriet, paused on Malik, then lingered a half-second longer on the armrest between them. A quick, silent assessment. Then she moved on, her stride changing ever so slightly, unnoticed by most. The next few minutes dripped by like honey. Passengers continued to board, most unaware of what had just occurred. But for those who had seen, or even overheard a fragment, the atmosphere had shifted. The woman in 4A tapped rapidly on her phone, fingers racing like she feared losing the moment's truth. The man in 6C removed his headphones, not to play music, but to listen to the cabin. Harriet, sensing the stares but unable to place their cause, began to fidget. She readjusted her neck pillow, fluffed her shawl again, pulled out a silk handkerchief to wipe an imaginary speck from the Birkin. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her face remained composed. She wasn't used to this kind of silence. She was used to soft chuckles, knowing nods, compliments on her bag, not to a cabin full of people pretending not to look at her. She leaned slightly toward Malek. You travel a lot for business, don't you? Her voice didn't seek answers. It sought relief, cold as porcelain wrapped in cellophane. Do you still find business class comfortable, or are you more used to private jets by now? A question laced with barbs. Malik didn't turn. I like sitting in the seat assigned to me, he said evenly. It's less complicated that way. Harriet let out a faint laugh, but it didn't echo. Well, she replied, her voice sliding closer to sharpness, some of us don't have the luxury of that kind of simplicity. Then almost deliberately, she sprayed again. Not much, but enough. Directed vaguely forward, right between them. Malik didn't blink. His eyes remained on the safety card in front of him, something he already knew by heart but pretended to study. The moment passed, but the tension didn't. It didn't fade. It thickened, began to take shape. The man in row 3 looked back again. The woman in 4 whispered to her seatmate, who shook their head. From the back of the cabin, a child's voice piped up, "Mommy, what's that weird smell?" A few soft shh sounds fluttered in reply. Near the galley, Elena approached the lead flight attendant, a man in his 40s with sharp eyes and a perpetually clenched jaw, named Marcus. She leaned in and spoke very softly. "We might have a situation in row 2. Marcus didn't look up. "Passenger complaint?" "Not exactly," Elena replied, "but 2A is spraying something. The passenger next to her hasn't reacted, but the vibe is off, and others are noticing." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Be specific." Elena hesitated. "It's not what he's doing. It's what he's not doing. But everyone's starting to watch." Marcus tapped his tablet, pulled up the passenger manifest, and scrolled quickly. When he saw the name Malik Stokes, he paused. 1 second, then 2. His jaw shifted slightly. "No action," he said. "Monitor. Log. Report if it escalates." Elena nodded and walked away. Marcus kept staring at the name. Within the airline system, a few passenger profiles were marked Genesis Protected. Malik Stokes was one of them. The file offered no specifics. It simply stated he had authority over the entire Starlux system and that any interference from staff was prohibited without elevated clearance. Back in seat 2B, Malik shifted slightly. Not enough to invade Harriet's space, but enough for the whole cabin to see he was present, fully, calmly, without apology. Harriet tensed. She grabbed a bottle of water and took a slow sip, the kind of gesture people make when trying to retake control of a room. But the room didn't respond. No one reset to her rhythm. People were still watching. The crew performed their final checks. The doors sealed. Bags were secured. The captain's voice came over the speaker. Neutral, steady, professional. But the energy in the cabin was anything but steady. It contracted, waited. As the plane began to taxi, Harriet leaned in close again, her voice barely a breeze. "I don't want to be difficult," she said, "but your presence, it makes me feel short of breath. Maybe it's the cologne or—" "I told you I don't wear cologne," Malik replied, eyes still forward. "Yes," Harriet said, "but sometimes body chemistry can be strong too." This time Malik turned to her. His eyes met hers, steady, unreadable, unafraid. "I understand," he said. "You're used to controlling the distance." Harriet blinked. "What did you say?" "Don't worry," he said. "Your discomfort has been noted, professionally." Harriet opened her mouth, but no words came out. Malik returned to the safety card. At Starlux Operations Center, a signal was logged into the Genesis system. Phase 1, complete. Phase 2, standby. A technician stared at her screen. "That's a lot of data for a domestic flight," she muttered. A supervisor looked up. "Which flight?" "ST-114. The supervisor frowned. "Isn't that—" "Yep," the technician replied, pulling up the cabin camera. "Seat 2B is online." Inside the aircraft, a teenage girl in row 6 whispered to her dad, "Is that Malik Stokes?" The man looked up, then looked forward. The name rang a bell. He opened his phone and began to search. Moments later, the plane lifted off as softly as breath, but the ground below was no longer still. Across servers, group chats, ops systems, and social media, the air was beginning to stir with noise. And in seat 2B, the man who hadn't flinched once was about to shake the entire aviation industry without saying a single word. The cabin had yet to speak, but it had already begun to stare. Not openly, not rudely, but consistently. A strange rhythm was taking shape. Quick glances, slight head turns, fingers frozen mid-scroll, a coffee cup suspended in mid-air, just long enough to suggest someone had noticed what was happening. Not just a man and a woman seated in row 2, but the invisible gap between them, a gap growing thicker, clearer, and more symbolic with every passing second. The tension didn't erupt. It was precise, compressed. For the first time in years, Harriet Caldwell realized that the shift wasn't in the words being spoken, but in the silence that surrounded them. She was a master of well-timed eyebrow raises and sighs delivered like punctuation. But now the room, or rather the cabin, no longer responded to her cues. She shifted slightly, looked out the window, turned back to the aisle, checked her phone as if waiting for some notification to break the atmosphere. Nothing came. She looked again at Malik, the man beside her, seated with perfect composure, hands resting gently on his lap. He hadn't moved, and yet somehow the control of the moment had slipped out of her hands without her realizing. Several rows behind, a passenger whispered, "Do you know who he is?" The other shrugged. A phone appeared. The search bar. A name typed. Results surfaced instantly. CEO, founder, aviation innovator. A quiet ripple began. Not loud, but real. Someone turned to their seatmate. Fingers pointed discreetly. The name spread through the cabin like rising temperature. Subtle, until someone began to sweat. Malik remained still. Beside him, Harriet crossed her legs, then uncrossed them. She retrieved a mirror from her handbag and adjusted her already flawless makeup. Her motions were precise but unsteady. A woman attempting to recalibrate the space around her with gestures. But the space had moved beyond her reach. The man beside her hadn't moved, and yet he had somehow shifted the room. Elena passed by. This time she didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her glance said everything. So did her silence. In the galley, Marcus opened the internal comm system. Phase 2 had been activated. Data was being tagged in real time. Keyword matches, behavior anomalies, latency spikes at 6 national gateways. Nothing urgent, yet. But Marcus saw the pattern. He tapped a line on his screen. Await horizontal protocol authorization. In the cockpit, the captain received a message. Not a verbal alert, just a discrete line on the security display. Passenger 2B, Stokes, M, status. Executive oversight active. Observation protocol in progress. Do not intervene without command. The captain blinked and straightened his posture. He understood what it meant. This was no longer a routine commercial flight. This was a live field test. Back in the cabin, the energy continued to shift silently. A man in seat 3C leaned slightly into the aisle. Not overtly, but enough to get a clearer view of Malik. The woman beside him whispered, "What's going on?" He shook his head. She sprayed something. He didn't move. That was all, but somehow that was enough. Harriet sensed the movement, the whispers. She adjusted her shawl and leaned toward Malik. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice low but calculated. "People today misjudge things all the time. I'm very supportive of diversity. I donate often." Malik turned slowly. "Donate?" he asked. "To what?" Harriet blinked. "To funds, scholarships, reading programs for underprivileged children. You know, social equity." Malik didn't respond. He didn't have to. At that moment, a woman in row 4 tapped send on a video. 32 seconds. No commentary, just footage of Harriet spraying the bottle. The audio was clear, her words unmistakable. "My skin is very sensitive. I can't sit next to strong cologne. It causes irritation." The video uploaded in 9 seconds. 5 minutes later, it had over 11,000 views. A caption was added, "Guess who owns the airline?" The algorithm took it from there. At Starlux's operations center in Denver, Camille Torres stood in front of the screen wall. The word live blinked red across multiple feeds. The head of analytics pointed to a chart. Engagement spiking. ST114 is trending. Hashtag forming. Approaching phase 3. Camille exhaled. No media response yet. Let it run its course. Back in row 2, Harriet sat upright but unraveled. Her hand hovered above the spray bottle but didn't reach for it. Not yet. The whispers had taken root. The stares had hardened. And they didn't blink. Elena returned one last time. No tray, no smile. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Harriet opened her mouth to answer, but Malik raised his hand gently. "It's fine." His voice was calm, even, but the entire cabin heard it clearly. Marcus received the signal. He looked at the front camera feed. The tension at row 2 had crystallized. Not chaos, not confrontation, just a compression, the kind that leads to something bigger, more public. He opened the crew comm channel. "Crew, remain in position. Activate observation mode." His voice didn't echo into the cabin. But the cabin didn't need it. It was already speaking in its own language. Across the country, people began sharing the clip. Within 20 minutes, the hashtag #Seat2B was trending. Within 40 minutes, a social equity coalition released a statement, without naming names. "Dignity doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be present." The post was reshared over 12,000 times in under an hour. Harriet looked down at her phone. A notification appeared, but she didn't open it. Something in her gut told her not to. The air felt thinner, the seat less comfortable. The control she once wore like a cloak had slipped away without her noticing. Meanwhile, Malik simply adjusted the brightness on his tablet. Nothing more. No statements, no gestures, just a single, quiet tap. But even that movement felt like a signature. Not resistance, but patience. In the very last row, a teenage boy asked his mother, "Why is everyone so quiet?" She replied, "Because sometimes, when something real is happening, silence is the one that speaks." The engines continued to hum. The pressure remained stable. The stares didn't blink. And the man in seat 2B had shifted the entire conversation without ever raising his voice. No one shouted. No one raised their voice. Yet first class had become a symphony of silent signals. A phone screen lit up, then dimmed. A glance drifted from seat 3B to 4A, a near subconscious nod between two strangers who had never exchanged a word. A man closed his laptop but kept his eyes forward, toward the still black man in 2B and the woman beside him whose composure was beginning to falter. These signals, subtle as they were, formed what media experts call a whisper network. No one needed to say it out loud. Everyone already knew what was happening. And more importantly, they knew they were witnessing something that might be on the morning news. Harriet began to feel a tightening in the air around her. It wasn't the engine. It was the shift in power, the kind she used to wield with ease. A well-timed smile, a carefully worded phrase, was now slipping through her fingers. And what unsettled her most was that this power wasn't being taken by argument, by shouting, or even by resistance. It was being peeled away, layer by layer, through silence, and by a man who said nothing at all. In the Starlux Media Control Hub, Camille Torres monitored the data screens like a live TV director. She didn't need to hit record. The system was already collecting and analyzing everything automatically. Viewer graphs spiked in sharp sine waves. A new clip surfaced, Malik tilting his head slightly toward Harriet just as she stammered about donating to social equity. Malik's quiet question, "Donate to what?" had become the main caption on Twitter. A prominent influencer wrote, "True power doesn't shout, it just asks the right question." The post reached 60,000 likes in under 3 hours. Meanwhile, Starlux's internal network was heating up. At 6 major national security hubs, top-level managers received the same alert. Suspend emergency media scripts. Return all monitoring to passive mode. Camille didn't want to escalate things. She understood that if they let this social storm grow organically, the company would have the opportunity to see who truly understood influence and who simply bent with the wind. In seat 5D, an elderly white-haired woman turned to her granddaughter and said in a thick Southern accent, "Honey, I've seen something like this before. Back then, no one dared say a word. But now it's different. There's a camera in everyone's pocket." The girl didn't respond. She just squeezed her grandmother's hand tighter, then opened her phone, activated video mode, and tilted the lens discreetly toward row 2. Meanwhile, Harriet clearly saw a young crew member whispering something to the lead attendant near the front of the cabin. It wasn't a heated conversation, just an exchange of glances, a slight nod. But to Harriet, it rang like an alarm bell in her head. She knew those looks. She used to command them. Now they were bouncing back at her like a chain reaction. She opened her phone. Over 200 notifications. A few were texts from acquaintances, but she didn't dare read them. The only thing she knew for sure was that something was spreading, and it wasn't going to help her. Malik, meanwhile, simply stared out the plane's window. In his eyes, there was no anger, no gloating. Only one thing: patience. The kind of patience forged over years of being misjudged, measured by appearance instead of merit. He knew, if he got angry, the narrative would flip. But if he stayed silent, they would do the rest. They would reveal who they were. A crew member entered first class again, her expression different now. Not afraid, aware. She whispered something into Elena's ear. Elena said nothing, just nodded and continued down the aisle toward row 2. But this time, she didn't ask anything. She simply looked at Malik and placed a glass of water on his tray. No words, but Malik understood. She knew. And that alone changed how everyone else looked at him. He didn't need an introduction, didn't need a business card, didn't need security. The Whisper network had done the work for him. The network of nods, of phones passed discreetly, of clips edited at just the right timestamp, captions crafted with surgical precision. It didn't have to be official to have official consequences. Harriet exhaled sharply and opened her mouth as if to push back, but she stopped, because she realized that anything she said now could be recorded. And worse, it could be clipped out of context and turned into a meme. She'd seen it happen to others. They didn't lose power because they did something wrong, but because they said too much of the right thing at the wrong time. At the operations center, Marcus, Camille's deputy, quietly issued a command. Freeze internal media logs for 72 hours. Maintain status. Camille nodded. She understood. The storm was still building, and if given full strength, it wouldn't just be a moment of virality, it would be a turning point. And somewhere within that Whisper network, it wasn't just passengers. There were pilots, ground crew, investors, and they were all listening. No one said it out loud, but everyone had chosen a side. No one looked directly at Harriet, but she could feel it. She was at the center of a stage, and every spotlight had already been turned on. Not because she was the lead actor, but because she had become the measuring stick of injustice. Every gesture she made, no matter how small, was dissected, judged, shared. And what Harriet wasn't used to, what truly unnerved her, was that she no longer controlled the context. The things she said, the things she believed to be harmless, were now vivid evidence of something people called entitlement. And for the first time in her life, that entitlement wasn't protecting her. It was suffocating her. She looked around the cabin. The space no longer felt like the luxurious enclave it had been, with soft lights and expensive perfumes. Now it resembled a silent courtroom. No jury, no defense attorneys, just eyes and silence. And Harriet could feel, with cold clarity, that she was no longer the one holding power in that room. What rattled her most was the gradual loss of familiarity. Every time she checked her phone and scrolled the news, she saw headlines that didn't name her, but pointed directly at her. Black passengers sprayed in first class by woman with scent sensitivity. Black CEO stays silent. Entire cabin reacts. Who's really the disruptive passenger? No one said Harriet Caldwell, but the world seemed to be calling her name in a quieter, more terrifying way, through symbolism. She began to feel as if she were drifting inside a fog. Not literal fog, but the kind only those who've lived long within privilege understand. When everything that was once easy becomes unclear. When convenience, once a default, suddenly disappears. When priority is no longer presumed. Harriet had always believed herself to be kind, fair, a successful woman who didn't see color. But now the way the world was responding told her clearly, no one was listening to what she claimed to be. They were paying attention to what she unintentionally revealed, and they were hearing it loud and clear. Another flight attendant passed by, a young man, calm expression, gaze gentle but decisive. He paused briefly, placed a tray at the row ahead, then glanced towards seat 2B. Not a curious look, a confirming one. Harriet saw it in his face. He knew. And for the first time, she felt it. Judgment. Malik remained seated like a stone tower in the tide. No reaction, no words. But the people around him had started choosing sides. Some looked up his background. Others shared clips. Some subtly moved closer to sit near him. Harriet noticed it all. A shift, not just in physical seats, but in power, in trust, in respect, which was no longer hers to command. She remembered boardroom meetings where she could silence a man with a raised brow. She remembered charity galas where she was invited to speak about diversity and inclusion without being questioned. But now the very diversity she had once proudly funded was staring back at her and asking questions. And the worst part was, she had no answers. Harriet pulled out her phone again. Her hand trembled slightly. On the screen was a message from her personal communications advisor. Do not respond. Do not post. Wait it out. But Harriet didn't want to wait. She was used to controlling things, to extinguishing sparks before they became flames. She started typing a post. I'm sorry if my actions were misunderstood. I had no intention of offending anyone, but she deleted it halfway. She knew, sorry if was no longer enough. The fog of entitlement was now tightening around her neck, turning every word into a liability. A young woman in row 4 leaned into the aisle, snapped a photo angled towards seat 2B, no tags, just a caption. We see, we remember, and we don't need to shout. The post was shared over 40,000 times in just 30 minutes. Marcus at operations was watching it unfold like a military campaign. He knew he couldn't control the internet, but he could shape the internal response. A directive was sent to the entire cabin crew. No filming, no comments regarding passenger 2B. Observe and report. Do not intervene. But he also knew that regardless of orders, what was happening had already exceeded the limits of any internal policy. This was now a cultural pivot. At last, Harriet lifted her head. She looked directly at Malik. I didn't think this would go so far, she said softly, her voice shaking. Malik turned to her, slowly. He didn't smile. He wasn't angry. You didn't think it would go far, because you've never had to walk that road, he replied. Harriet swallowed. She had no words left to rebut, because she understood. The truth didn't need to be screamed in someone's face. It only needed to be seen. The cabin grew even quieter, not from fear but from respect. No one called Malik by name, but now everyone knew. This was a man whose words weighed more than titles, and his silence, right now, was the loudest sound on the entire flight. No announcement was made. No one stood up to slam a table. Yet the first-class cabin of Starlux Flight 217 had entered a state of tension that every passenger could feel. The air was no longer merely silent. It felt compressed, vibrating with frequencies no one could hear, but everyone could sense. Harriet sat still, her seatbelt fastened as if it were the last thing she could control in that moment. Her hands rested on her lap, not trembling anymore, but far from steady. She knew something was moving quickly around her now, and this time, it wasn't the thrust of the engines. A female flight attendant approached Malik's seat. She said nothing. She placed a small navy blue envelope on his tray table and bowed slightly. Malik tilted his head, his eyes calm, as if he had expected this. He didn't open the envelope. He didn't ask why. He simply said slowly, "Thank you." Harriet turned to glance at the envelope but couldn't see what it contained. She assumed it was a personal apology letter. But what made it hard for her to breathe was the fact that the letter wasn't for her. Everything was changing, but it wasn't changing in the way she knew. No announcements, no explanations, only action. A few rows back, a middle-aged woman, likely a lawyer, quietly opened her laptop and began typing. She titled her document, Case Note, Discriminatory Behavior in Aviation, Live Witness Account. No one had told her to take notes. No one had asked her to speak up. But she understood. Some moments, if left undocumented, would later become collective denial. And she didn't want to be silent again. Harriet heard the faint rumble of the aircraft, not due to turbulence, but because of the mental collisions unfolding in everyone's minds. Decisions were forming, reactions were consolidating. A man in a suit from seat 3A suddenly stood up, approached the lead flight attendant, and whispered something. No one could hear the words, but shortly after, the attendant returned to the cabin and opened an internal message on her tablet. On the screen appeared a directive. Request review of crew behavior. Passenger 2B to remain undisturbed. Harriet recognized him. He was the executive vice president of a major investment fund that had once backed the Diversity in Air campaign, and now he was standing with Malik, not through a speech but through a single quiet gesture. In the operations center, Camille tracked the data stream. Engagement rates had spiked by 17% in just 45 minutes. But what was unusual this time was that the latest video had no sound. It was a silent clip capturing the moment Harriet looked at Malik, saying nothing. But her eyes, her lips pressed tight, the way she gripped her phone until her knuckles turned white. It was all interpreted as a visual symbol of the panic when privilege is challenged. No audio needed. Escalation had arrived through glances alone. Malik had done nothing. Still seated, still calm, yet his very presence was forcing every part of the system to re-examine itself. A ground staffer emailed the cabin. Should we prepare special reception protocol for passenger 2B upon landing? Another replied, await VP instruction. No independent action. Harriet could read the eyes of the crew. For the first time in her life, she understood what it felt like to have decisions made around her, without her input. A young white passenger in row 6 leaned in to whisper to his travel companion, "Do you think any of this would have happened if he were a white man in a suit?" The question had no answer, but it didn't need one. It had already opened a new thread of thought in a cabin thickening by the second, with unspoken tension. Harriet finally spoke, for the first time in nearly an hour. "I think people are misunderstanding what happened." Malik looked at her. No frown, no smile. He simply replied, "Maybe. But the real concern is why it's so easy for people to misunderstand it this way. Not a counterattack. Just a line of dialogue placed in the exact right moment, with no raised voice. But that quiet precision was what made the entire cabin freeze. Everyone understood. This was the crest of the wave, and it was crashing without a single sound. A journalist flying under anonymity was typing a draft article on their phone. Escalation without volume, the story of new power at 30,000 feet. It hadn't been published yet, but it had already been submitted to editorial. Everyone now realized the moment unfolding wasn't just an in-flight incident. It had become a litmus test. And Harriet, though no one said it aloud, was now the living exam of a fading generation of leadership. Not because she intentionally did wrong, but because she never realized she had become part of the problem. The system Harriet once regarded as a fortress of power, a blend of algorithms, policies, and protocols designed to protect the premium customer experience, was now turning against her. Not through rebellion, not through protest, but through the very thing she always believed to be invisible: data. Inside Starlux's operations room, a team of senior staff quietly unlocked a series of internal data streams, accessing the service encryption history, priority handling logs for first-class passengers, reports on cabin crew behavior toward specific demographic groups. Camille, the head of passenger experience and human rights, stood before a massive screen, arms crossed. She said nothing, but her eyes stopped on one faint red line. Flagged behavior, FCL2, B sequence/auto deprioritized. A system code, lightweight, but more dangerous than any direct insult. Camille typed a command to pull up the definition of FCL2B. The description appeared: passenger flagged as mismatched to expected experience, based on appearance data, temporarily deprioritized for in-cabin service. No one in the room spoke, but they all understood. This was a directive Harriet had personally approved 3 years ago in a closed-door meeting, justified as optimizing consistency in premium experience. A polished term for a discriminatory mechanism no one had to name. Malik still hadn't spoken, but inside the cabin the shift was undeniable. One of the attendants, Lauren, who had served Harriet for years, for the first time did not respond to her pleading glance. Not coldly, not with spite, just with neutrality. Lauren knew what was unfolding, and in her heart nothing was more convincing than a system exposing its own fault lines. She had seen those codes before. She remembered the training where a supervisor had told them, when code 2B appears, double-check documents, slow down service, and observe behavior closely. At the time, she didn't question it. She thought it was about security. Now she knew it was about codifying bias. Harriet had no idea the team was tracing that code back. She only knew one thing. People no longer treated her the same. No more polite nods. No more waiting for her cues. Even the way water was served to her had changed. Not rude, but no longer reverent. Marcus, the system operations supervisor, sent an interim report to the executive board. Recommend immediate suspension of code FCL-2B. Request full audit of anonymous behavior tagging architecture. Signs of media leak increasing. In the reply from legal, one question made Marcus freeze. Who authorized the original tag? The answer was clear. Harriet Caldwell, back when she was chief of passenger strategy. Back when no one objected. She was once celebrated for taking personalization to a new level. But now she was the first traceable marker that the system was flawed. Back on the aircraft, a female passenger, using a Whisper QE reader, opened an article by a freelance journalist. Some privileges don't need to be written in handbooks. They're encoded, and whoever writes the code holds the real power. She glanced at the image attached to the piece. It was Malik, blurred behind the cabin window. The photo had become a symbol of something larger, a generation that didn't need to shout to be heard. They only needed the truth. Harriet still held her phone. She checked the internal mail. Nothing. But what unsettled her most was this. No one had asked for her guidance. In past crises, she was always the first person consulted. Now not a single message, not a single call. As if the system was quietly phasing her out of command, subtly but decisively. Camille issued a discreet internal message to the flight crew. Suspend all enhanced actions for passengers flagged with code FCL-2B. Internal audit in progress. That message struck like an invisible blade through the very power structure Harriet had once architected. No one declared her wrong, but the system was already correcting course, away from her. Another flight attendant, Jonah, approached Harriet and offered a polite bow. Would you like another blanket, ma'am? The question sounded courteous, but the tone lacked deference. Harriet understood. The system had begun turning its back, and what chilled her wasn't the anger. It was the cold silence of the lines of code, the ones she had once signed off on. In the cabin, the lights dimmed slightly in preparation for descent. No one said a word, but the truth didn't need to be spoken aloud. It was surfacing, layer by layer, behind the curtain. And for the first time in her life, Harriet felt herself being reprogrammed, not by machines, but by human eyes. At first, it was just a message between two flight attendants in the business class galley. The man in 2B is named Malik Dawes. No additional details, no link attached, but it was the emptiness of the message that made it haunting. Because that name, in the context of the 3-hour stretch of taut silence, summoned a flood of unspoken questions. Malik Dawes, a name that felt both unfamiliar and deeply familiar. Not a celebrity, not a loud activist, but if you had ever worked inside the operational structure of a major airline, the name wasn't unknown. Some said he had once been the lead data engineer at Polaris Airlines, overseeing passenger behavior analytics. Others claimed he walked away from a $3 billion acquisition deal after discovering systemic biases in how the airline served different regions and languages. A young attendant pulled up LinkedIn and typed the name. It only took seconds. The profile appeared. No photo, just one line beneath his name. Believes a good system should be capable of shame. No one laughed. No one clicked connect. But after reading that single sentence, the way they looked at the man sitting silently in seat 2B changed completely. Not because he held power, but because he had once built the very kind of power they now served. Harriet sensed it. No one spoke the name aloud, but she felt it moving around the cabin like a soundless whisper, as if every glance had silently agreed to refer to him through recognition, not language. For the first time during the entire flight, Harriet unlocked her phone and typed in the name. She read the biography, brief, cold, unpretentious, but enough to tell her she wasn't facing a passenger, she was facing a philosophy. At the Starlux Operations Center, Camille was fielding messages from staff across different departments. No one stated it outright, but they were all asking the same thing. Is it really him? Camille didn't respond, but she knew. When a name starts circulating without a single official mention, the system has already begun to fracture. Out of fear, not of scandal, but of the truth being revealed by someone who says nothing at all. One internal communications manager murmured to a colleague, "If the news breaks that Harriet denied seat 2B to Malik with his full name attached, we're not just another airline under scrutiny. We'll be the airline that turned its back on the man who rewrote the ethics of the entire industry." The colleague added more harshly, "Or worse, we'll be the airline that didn't even realize we were flying with Malik Dawes." Malik still hadn't moved, but now he was no longer just a black man seated in first class with a modest appearance. He had become a collective memory, the man who authored the equitable treatment protocols for 7 major carriers, the man who resigned from board positions after exposing performative diversity practices, the man who once said in a quiet podcast, "Real change doesn't need a spotlight. It needs listening until the very last minute." And now he was making every glance. Listen. Lauren, the flight attendant who had remained silent throughout the flight, finally messaged her supervisor. "I don't feel comfortable continuing service for Harriet unless her profile is formally reassessed." No reply came, but her message was a crack, however small, in the structure of compliance. Meanwhile, Malik hadn't looked at anyone, hadn't spoken, hadn't provoked. Yet every passenger was beginning to understand that the man sitting among them was living proof of something deeper than any rulebook. A person without a title, because his silence was forcing the entire system to speak. A young girl seated near the emergency exit whispered to her mother, "Who do you think he is?" The mother replied softly, "I don't know. But I'm guessing this is the last flight where someone will dare say he doesn't belong here." On an anonymous aviation service behavior blog, a post began to trend. Passenger 2B, the man who didn't call for a manager, didn't record a video, just sat still and triggered a full-blown systems crisis. Within the hour, it had over 6,000 shares, and the name repeated in every comment thread was Malik. Harriet looked around. Everything was still, but she knew power was no longer in her hands. No one needed to strip it away. They only needed to remember another name and revisit everything she had ever done under the light of that name. For the first time in her career, Harriet saw herself becoming the one who no longer qualified to sit here. Not because she had done something wrong, but because now the definition of right had shifted. And Malik, the man she once referred to as the passenger who doesn't quite match first-class service, was now the name making her entire system whisper in one undeniable sound: the truth. 12 minutes after the name Malik Dawes began to quietly circulate, Harriet still hadn't made a move. Not because she didn't want to, but because she couldn't. What used to be a simple reflex of power, a relocation order, had now become a bomb no one dared to detonate. Not because it would explode, but because now everyone knew it wouldn't. And that silence, that collective hesitation, was the most terrifying part. Harriet stood near the front of the cabin, phone in hand. On the screen, an outgoing call to ground security remained unconnected. Her finger hovered over the call button, but she didn't press. Ahead of her, Malik remained seated in 2B, hands on his lap, eyes straight ahead. No defiance, no pleading. He was simply there, as if that seat had always belonged to him, without permission, without explanation. A flight attendant approached Harriet quietly and asked, "We need a clear directive. If a seat change is required, who will sign off on it?" Harriet didn't respond. The attendant looked at her for a moment, then stepped back. In her eyes, there was something like pity. Not for Malik, but for the manager who had once embodied authority, now adrift in a system she herself had built. Mid-cabin, Lauren, the attendant Harriet had previously scolded, had quietly switched service zones. No one had told her to, but every passenger noticed. She walked slower, made more eye contact. And when she poured Malik's water, her hands didn't tremble like the others. No apology, no explanation, just a silent respect, as if she were serving someone who had trained the entire industry to recognize that kind of dignity. From the ground operations office, Camille sent a final message to the crew. Do not relocate. Maintain current seating. Any further decisions will be handled by legal post-landing. Harriet read the message. Her hand tightened around the phone. No one saw her face change, but from the way she stood, everyone understood. A chapter of power had quietly closed, not with a revolution, but with a single instruction. Do nothing. An older passenger seated behind glanced up at Malik. He said nothing, just nodded. Malik looked back and nodded too. No one else noticed, but in that split second, a form of old-world power had been passed. Not through rank, not through business cards, but through a silent agreement between those who understood that true justice doesn't need to shout to exist. On Twitter, a quiet passenger posted, "I'm sitting 3 rows behind 2B. That man hasn't said a word, and yet the whole plane has shifted around him." No hashtag, no photo, but the tweet was immediately shared by a veteran aviation journalist with the comment, "If that's Malik Dawes, then this is the industry's final exam." The ripple began. In the cabin, Harriet turned away. No one knew where she intended to go, but what was certain, she would not approach 2B again, because she now understood no name tag, no title was needed, only one decision not made, one action not taken, was enough to make everyone realize the balance had shifted. No one moved Malik. No one dared assume the task. And so, the action that didn't happen, the relocation of a passenger, became the loudest moment of the entire flight. Not because it had never been done before, but because this time it was no longer possible. Not because of a lack of staff, but because the truth was too present. The move that didn't happen became a symbol, a moment where authority chose to retreat, where leadership chose to disappear, where the system chose to pause and watch itself in the mirror. Malik didn't win. He didn't need to. He only needed to stay. And that presence, that simple existence, forced the entire system to ask, who really doesn't belong here? The announcement came from the cockpit at 5:32 p.m. We are now beginning our descent into Newark International Airport. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your seatbacks are in their upright position. A routine statement, except this time, it meant something more. No one said it out loud, but almost everyone knew the flight was not only descending geographically, it was closing a chapter of power, of a person, and of a way of seeing. Harriet was no longer at the front of the cabin. She had moved back to the seats near the mid-cabin lavatory, sitting beside a young off-duty flight attendant. In her hands, there was no clipboard, no iPad, no supervisory posture. Only a plastic bottle of water and a gaze trying to preserve the last remnants of control. Even though she knew deep down that control was no longer necessary. The system no longer followed her, not because it rebelled, but because it had learned to self-correct when it no longer believed in her direction. Malik remained in seat 2B, belt fastened, hands resting lightly on his lap, eyes fixed on the window where the late afternoon sun was shifting into a deeper orange. No one spoke to him. No one needed to. The mere fact that he was still sitting in that seat, unchallenged, unrelocated, undiminished, was a statement the entire cabin had silently agreed upon. Another flight attendant, one who normally worked the economy section, passed by to check seatbelts. She paused briefly, nodded almost unconsciously, and moved on. Malik lifted an eyebrow, not as a reply, but as if acknowledging something overdue. And that glance, not accusatory, not instructive, but deeply reflective, was what made the system incapable of returning to the way it was. From the Ground Operations Center, Camille received a message from legal. Flight 804 may be involved in internal procedural violations. Preserve full cabin video log. No press statements to be released without clearance. What did it mean? It meant Harriet and the entire crew were now under review. No one said they were wrong, but no one said they were right either. They had simply been bypassed, not by revolt, but by inaction, by a man who never raised his voice. In seat 3C, a businessman with a Tag Heuer watch quietly packed his laptop. He watched Malik for 3 full minutes before looking away. Not out of curiosity, but because he recognized something in this man that 20 years on Wall Street had never given him: composure without position. The aircraft trembled gently as the wheels touched down. Passengers stood, not with chaos, but with a rhythm that suggested everyone was ready to move forward without looking back. Everyone except Harriet, who remained seated. She knew she had no further role to rise for. She knew that if she walked out first, people would avoid her eyes. If she walked last, those eyes would follow her all the way to the terminal floor. So she sat still, letting time close a program that once bore her name, now swallowed by silence. In the VIP lounge, a media team was waiting for a senior figure arriving from California. They had no idea the person who truly deserved the interview was turning left, exiting through a side door, in a dark cloth jacket and a faded canvas backpack, unnoticed as Malik Dawes. No cameras, no red carpet. He stepped quietly onto the escalator, merging into the crowd as if no difference had ever existed. In the cockpit, the captain reviewed the passenger manifest once more. He said to his co-pilot simply, "Seat 2B," remained in place the entire flight. And that sentence, seemingly technical, became the final confirmation that some flights don't alter course, but they change how an entire system sees itself. As for Harriet, when she finally disembarked, no one looked at her as a company representative anymore. No whispers. But the empty space around her said enough. The polite nods from colleagues no longer carried trust, only fatigue, not from the flight, but from realizing there are people who, even without giving orders, can bring an entire legacy of power to a place where it has nowhere left to land. The moment the plane's wheels touched down on the Newark runway, the first report had already landed, in the inboxes of 3 people who weren't on the flight but had the authority to decide the fate of everyone who was. One of them was Kendra Morales, Senior Vice President of Human Resources for the airline, known for 2 things: never appearing in the media and never taking longer than 6 minutes to respond to internal alerts. When she opened the email, the subject line read cold and clear: IR084/Tier 2 alert, Flight 804, cabin leadership behavior/priority, URGENT. The report did not begin with a conclusion. It simply listed facts. A passenger named Malik Dawes was seated in first class, assigned to his correct seat. He showed no signs of disruption, no policy violations, yet he was asked to change seats without a clear reason. He refused. He did not speak. However, the systemic reaction that followed included altered behavior from flight attendants, scattered coordination among crew, command decisions from ground control being bypassed, and most critically, the authority of the lead cabin supervisor rendered ineffective without a single act of defiance. Attached were extracted cabin camera footage, internal radio logs, and a 90-second passenger-recorded video that had already gone viral on X, formerly Twitter, garnering over 500,000 views within 3 hours. Kendra was not rattled. She typed 3 lines into the internal Slack. "I want a full report from the crew before 9 p.m., especially from Harriet. No ghostwriting, no PR filter. It must be in her own words." No one in the system dared leave that message marked seen without responding. But at that moment, Harriet was still unaware. She had just pulled her suitcase out of Gate 5C, terminal lights casting across her face like a quiet reminder. She no longer belonged to the untouchable echelon. In a 34th floor conference room at headquarters, the first printed copy of the report was placed on the table. The paper bore no bold header, but a handwritten red ink note from a legal board member read, "If this content holds up and there's no contradicting evidence in 24 hours, the company must prepare a distancing statement regarding Harriet Ross." A silent confirmation that someone once beyond reproach was now being formally isolated. No one declared Harriet guilty, but none of the evidence stood in her favor. And that's the most dangerous kind of report. Not one that accuses, but one that leaves no room for protection. Subsequent copies were routed to the media team, brand risk managers, and Human Rights Strategic Council, none of whom had ever met Harriet. Yet all were preparing responses for press inquiries about an incident no one would label as discrimination, but everyone understood precisely for what it was: Malik didn't show his face. He didn't post anything. He didn't respond to any media outreach. But it was that silence that sent the entire system into panic, because it couldn't be debated and it couldn't be denied. Internally, the report had earned a nickname, the 2B shockwave, an unofficial term, but it traveled through every executive tier within 6 hours. Harriet was summoned to headquarters the next morning. The stated reason, to review Flight 804's in-flight conduct protocols. But she knew. No one invites the honored to review procedure. She asked no questions. But in her eyes, upon reading the meeting request, something cracked. Not from punishment, but from being quietly sidelined from the very system she once orchestrated. Kendra reread the final section of the report. There was a quote from one of the flight's passengers. "I've never seen an entire crew freeze, not for technical reasons, but because no one dared to give an order." A sentence without bias, but with weight, because it described exactly what happens when a system, confronted with true dignity, loses its ability to pretend. And Harriet? As she sat in the car on her way back to the hotel, she opened the airline's internal app and noticed her avatar was no longer listed under Command Representative, Domestic First Class Division. She hadn't been fired, no memo had said so, but the title was gone, and sometimes a single name disappearing from a list is a far louder ending than any official announcement. The following morning, the headquarters in Chicago opened earlier than usual. Inside the 21st floor, a conference room had been reserved under a vague title, Special Situation Analysis, Flight 804. No presenter's name was listed. No one was formally under review, but everyone in the room knew who the meeting was about. And strangely, her name never appeared on a single slide. On the large screen, the only image shown was of the first-class cabin, a side angle from the security camera. No one spoke. They just watched a black man in a simple fabric coat sitting still in seat 2B, his eyes looking toward the window. The sunlight lit half his face, sharpening the calmness in his expression. Beside him was the empty seat, the one that was supposed to be his replacement, untouched. The report was excerpted in 3 segments. Not a single phrase mentioned resistance, defiance, or noncompliance. Only one word repeated, unmoved. And it was that word that became the focal point of systemic discomfort. For the first time, they couldn't draft a defense narrative. No one had been shouted at. No one was humiliated in a viral video. There was no public breakdown. And yet something had happened, something that would force every procedure to be rewritten. Because one man didn't leave his seat. Elsewhere in the airline's marketing lounge where branding campaigns were showcased, a quiet decision was made. The poster reading, "Our people lead with confidence," was taken down. Some had started asking, where was that confidence when we asked someone to move, simply because he didn't look like what we expected? No one answered, but the poster was gone that same day. As for Malik, he didn't go on television, he didn't write a book, he didn't post a single tweet. But a week later, a letter arrived at headquarters, sent by mail, in a plain brown envelope with no markings. Inside was a single photo, seat 2B, taken from behind. On the back, handwritten in neat cursive, "Sometimes dignity is not loud. It just doesn't move." There was no signature, but the CEO, upon seeing it, ordered it to be sent immediately to the Office of Internal Culture. Within 72 hours, an unprecedented meeting was held between frontline leaders, titled Reevaluating Presence and Assumptions. Malik didn't have to be there, but his presence, carved into silence, could no longer be ignored. And Harriet? She wasn't fired. No internal memo ever said so. But her name quietly disappeared from the list of priority flight leadership. Those she had trained no longer mentioned her in the corridors. They weren't hostile, but they no longer lifted their heads when she walked past. She continued showing up to the office for a few weeks, but she no longer led Monday morning briefings. One day she sent an email requesting a 3-month leave for health reasons. The system approved it instantly, without a single question. No farewell gathering was held, and no one suggested bringing her back. In a closed internal interview, one flight attendant, who had witnessed the entire event, was asked, "Why do you think that passenger never spoke up?" She simply answered, "Because sometimes, if you're strong enough to stay, Everything else has to move around you. 3 months later, a short clip went viral online. A passenger had casually recorded the first-class cabin on Flight 438 and happened to capture Malik sitting once again in seat 2B, reading a book. This time, nothing happened. No one asked him to move. No flight attendant paused. And perhaps it was that very lack of disruption that made the video hit over 3 million views. The caption simply read, "He didn't have to fight. He just stayed." The story didn't end with a public apology. There was no explosive internal revolution. It ended with the realization that no one dared underestimate someone again, based on appearance, skin color, or silence. It ended with every system, every person, every gaze, being forced to relearn something ancient. Dignity does not need to speak to exist. And if you've ever wondered what makes a seat become a symbol, the answer is this. When everyone wants you to move, but you choose to stay, not with rage, not with fear, not with demands, just with presence, staying exactly where you deserve to be. And if you've ever wondered what turns a seat into a symbol, the answer is this. When an entire system wants you to disappear, but you don't yell, you don't pound the table, you don't say a single word, you just stay. And that presence, quiet but unshakable, makes it so no one dares look away again. Malik didn't ask for compensation. He didn't ask for an apology. He didn't ask to be remembered. But from that day on, every black passenger, every elderly woman in plain clothes, every delivery worker who stepped into first class was looked at differently. Not because the system had changed, but because someone once chose not to leave. Maybe what makes people change isn't the fear of being exposed, but the quiet shame of realizing they were wrong, with no one else left to blame. And if you're still watching this, I want to ask you one thing. Have you ever been asked to leave your seat simply because someone thought you didn't belong there? Have you ever walked away with your head down and thought, what if I had stayed? Tell me your story in the comments below, because when you share, you help thousands of others know they're not alone. That kindness doesn't need a microphone, and that some seats, once claimed with dignity, force the entire world to reposition itself around them. If this story made you feel something, whether it was warmth, outrage, or simply renewed belief that small acts can spark real change, please hit like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. This isn't just a video, it's a reminder. Silence can shake the system if you refuse to bow. Drop your answer in the comments. Did you stay in your seat, or were you once forced to stand up? And if you've ever seen someone treated unfairly, share it. We're listening. And together we won't let anyone have to stand up in silence again.